Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you, Brother Chris Ludke.
Listeners, scholars, brothers, this is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to explore the plum, not the delicious fruit that comes out in the fall that no one actually eats, and then it becomes a prune, and then we feed it to small children and old people. I'm not sure how that works. But the plum, the tool that we look at in the second degree. Now, the plum was originated as an essential tool by operative masons for the construction of building. This instrument, typically fashioned out of wood or metal, typically with a string or weight attached, was crucial in ensuring that structures were erected in a perpendicular way. When you're building anything along the lines of the Greek temples, the Temple of Solomon, etc., of course, having a plumb and straight wall is going to be important. As speculative Freemasonry emerged, this emblem of a builder's workmanship transformed into a powerful symbolic instrument to teach moral lessons, which I could have said about just about any of our tools. The plumb thus became one of the working tools, in this case, of the fellowcraft, and a vital component of Masonic ceremony. So let's look at what a plumb is to begin with, and this goes a little bit beyond definition because it actually plays into the language in some interesting ways, non-Masonic language. The plumb, or sometimes the plumb rule, is an instrument of antiquity. It's one of the earliest instruments of architecture. Really, when you think about it, it's a string. Admittedly, a string with a weight, but it's a string. One of the first things that we had to use for architectural forms. The earliest craftsmen used a weighted cord as a plumb. The first practical Romans, or the ever practical Romans, took the word and Latinized it. Shocking, seeing as how they're Roman. And it became the word plumbum, the tool to measure perpendiculars of structures, walls, aqueducts, and fortifications in every corner of the Roman Empire. To them, it's basically a string with a weight of lead at the bottom. The Gauls adopted the tool, and their successors, the Normans, shortened the word to plumb, P-O-L-O-M-B, so it's not quite what you would expect. By the way, the Roman term for the plumb line becomes the term for lead on the periodic table. So the reason lead is PB is because of the Roman term for a plumb line, which usually uses lead as a weight. The Britons then add the letter A to coin a new word, a plumb, meaning not easily upset, not off-center. Later, the English revised the spelling to plumb as we know it today, and it became a verb as well as a noun. The French begin to call the lead bob, the weight at the bottom, a ball. In French, ball, B-O-U-L-E, means a ball of lead. Small leaden balls, or balls, were primitive bullets. The Latins modified the word to bulla. They used very small bulla when they compressed them into thin wafers, utilizing it as a legal seal for documents. Thus is born the papal bull, definitely not of bovine origin, the papal bull being effectively a papal edict. While originally a simple lead weight on a string, the plumb, when required by expert craftsmen, evolved into the shape of the junior warden's jewel and specifically adapted for operative stonemasons. It should be noted that the string hanging down is as effective to prove vertical as is the point at the bottom. So when you're actually using it, it's not always about that lead weight or the weight at the bottom. It's about the string. You can measure from that. It's using gravity to create a perfect vertical. And that way I can measure my wall against something specific, because otherwise it becomes a question of relative verticalness. And of course, relative things are not terribly effective in building. In terms of Masonic definition, the line teaches the criterion of rectitude, to avoid dissimulation in conversation and action, and to direct our steps in the path which leads to immortality, something that in Wisconsin we get at actually in the installation ceremony when we talk about the line as one of the tools of the lodge. This idea of the immortal life was always connected symbolically with that of the perpendicular, something that rose directly upward, which is what a plumb does. So if we ignore the weight at the bottom for a moment and you think about the line going up, because it uses gravity, that line must necessarily point directly up, which, as we see in Gothic cathedrals or other architecture, the idea of verticality, a pilaster, a column, etc., drawing your eye up, always draws your mind to the spiritual, which gives us a clue as to what the plumb really means. Philosophically, the plumb assures us that as long as we are standing firm on level ground, bringing in the level, we can find the right thing to do. In the most simple sense, the plumb teaches us to stand uprightly in our several stations before man and God. In other words, act properly. And that's the most basic interpretation that you can have for this tool. And it's not about, stand upright like the plumb. It's imagining that you have that plumb line running through your spine, always pointed to the heavens. If you were to waver to the left or the right, it no longer is going to read properly, giving the impression of no longer working within the proper moral framework laid out by the square or reminiscent of the level. Now, there are other teachings that go with it. The plumb's primary symbolism, of course, is that of moral uprightness, moral rectitude, exemplifying the virtues of truth, justice, and integrity. When applied to human conduct, the plumb emphasizes the importance of leading a life that adheres to the highest moral principles, unwavering in the face of adversity or temptation, reminding us that even in the worst of circumstances, we need to keep ourselves under control, of course, subduing our passions. When it comes to justice and integrity, the plumb is a physical tool embodying the idea of strict adherence to standards, leaving no room for deviation in the construction of our spiritual temple. In a similar vein, the speculative Freemason uses this concept as a guiding principle to stay true to our values regardless of circumstance. Consistency, which is an idea that we have come across before. It's like balance. It's one of these overarching ideas that we see popping up throughout the working tools and lessons of Freemasonry. Now, it also gets at ideas of the pursuit of truth. Freemasons view the pursuit of truth as essential to their mission, and the plumb embodies that pursuit. Guided by the metaphorical plumb line, a Freemason must always seek the truth and convey it to others. This is not, hey, I'm going to tell the truth even though it hurts, or we've all heard the excuse, someone says something highly inappropriate and they go, but it's the truth. It's not that. It's more along the lines of the Buddhist concept of right mind. In other words, having the knowledge of what is the correct thing to say under the circumstance. What can you say? What can't you say? And understanding these ideas. This dedication to honesty and openness forms the foundation of the brotherhood, as trust in one another is fundamental to our success. It also refers to the idea of overcoming adversity. The undeviated steadfastness associated with the plumb implores Freemasons to maintain their convictions even in difficult times. Again, this idea of consistency, specifically consistency in the most difficult of circumstances. In facing adversity or hardship, a Freemason must embrace the lessons taught by the plumb by remaining resolute in their beliefs, never yielding to temptation or surrendering to despair or to desire. So it reminds us to look at that framework, to reflect on what we have done in the past so that we can remain in that vertical position, upright in our several stations, no matter what comes across our life. It gives us the idea that we must always maintain those standards. There's never really an excuse not to. For a Mason, you are not permitted to let your passions run wild and do something that you will later regret. The Plumb is constantly reminding us of this. It also reminds us to balance, and balance, of course, one of those key areas, to balance ambition with humility. As an FC progresses in their journey, they must employ the guidance of the Plumb to find equilibrium between ambition and humility. And as you know, we can definitely go too far one way or the other. You've all met people who are very humble, very people-pleasing, but they will not go anywhere in life, as well as people who are all about going somewhere in life and basically forget those around them. By using the plumb line to gauge their actions and desires, Freemasons can strive for great achievements without succumbing to self-aggrandizement or egotism. Because how can you have ego when you constantly have an eye towards the spiritual, towards something that is larger than you? This is an acceptance that there is more out there. The Plumb very much teaches us to look outward from ourselves. Don't focus on the internal here, but rather focus on the external. How are other people going to see us? How will we be viewed within the community? Yes, there will be people who don't like you, and that's perfectly fine. At the end of the day, the Plumb basically argues that you need to apply the same principles in your interactions with them that you do in your interactions with, well, anyone else. Now, interestingly, if you take the Plumb and you add it to the level and the square, you get into some interesting situations. To operative Masons, the level and the Plumb were intertwined, and together they form a square, which makes perfect sense. If I know the level and I know the vertical, the Plumb, then that vertical and horizontal come together to create a square. And they allow us to square our actions with virtue. They give us, both of them, the level and the Plumb, remind us of moral rectitude. They remind us of moral framework, that we are part of something larger, and therefore we cannot simply apply our own rules to all of life, that we have to fit in to the larger society. We have to accept the social contract, as we see coming out of Enlightenment ideas in England and elsewhere. Brethren, the Plumb is an instrument used in architecture by which a building is raised in perpendicular, in other words, vertically, and it is figurative of an upright and true course in life. It typifies care against deviation from the Masonic upright line of conduct. If you apply the square to the level, you get the Plumb. The living perpendicular is esteemed by all true craftsmen, the emblem of growth and immortality. Because the level must necessarily mean growth, because we travel upon the level of time to that country who once born, no traveler returns. It's time. The Plumb reminds us of moral rectitude. And so as we travel in this journey of life, we must necessarily constantly have an eye towards the spiritual, towards that larger framework. Is a truly magnificent jewel, an indispensable working tool, and when applied to the work with its fellows, the square and the level, it opens the doorway of that middle chamber in those immortal mansions whence all goodness will emanate. At the end of the day, when we add these three tools together, the square, the level, and the Plumb, they all speak to the same basic principle, which is equality and spirituality, moral rectitude. I'm using the term spirituality, but any kind of moral framework could be applied here. That's why we have to have a belief in a supreme being. Because without it, then you really don't have an understanding of what is outside of something larger than yourself, or at least that's the argument made when Masonry develops. And so it reminds us, hey, remember your virtue. Remember the tenets of Freemasonry, those cardinal virtues. Use those tools as you travel through the level of time so that you can remain this staunch and upright Mason, this brother who others will look up to throughout time. In terms of practical application, marking a fellow craft's progression through the degrees, we see the plumb line, of course, as this prominent symbol. The candidate is instructed to live uprightly and in accordance with the moral teachings represented by the plumb. During the ceremony, the scripture passage from Amos chapter 7, verse 7 is recited, again referring to a plumb line, symbolizing the exacting standards by which deity will measure humanity. The use of the plumb in our interactions with fellow man is reinforced by our obligation as Freemasons. Upon our obligation, we approach each other with the assurance that we are bound together. But the use of the plumb in measuring our uprightness to our obligations can only be used to judge ourselves. Keep in mind that this line is not accurate when we cast it towards someone else, when we cast it in judgment. In other words, if we start judging someone else's moral framework, if we start judging others based on our moral framework, then the line ceases to function properly. You can't throw a plumb and expect it to be horizontal. And the tool that would be proper for that, the level, would also teach us not to judge each other. And so this is a reminder that we should not judge other people and their journey. In this case, we need to focus on ourselves. That plumb can only apply to ourselves. And this makes sense in a fraternity where religion is something that we simply do not discuss. We don't talk about it. We don't ask people, hey, what exactly are your religious beliefs? Because that would be casting the plumb. And that's where that becomes a real problem. The virtue it embodies, the plumb embodies, honesty, integrity, justice, uncompromising faith in one's convictions, in other words, in this case, moral framework, are fundamental to the successful practice of both the Masonic and non-Masonic aspects of life. We apply them just as much in the lodge as we should outside of it. If I am seen as an upright and just person within the walls of my lodge, I should be seen the same way when I'm working in my career, when I'm serving my community, when I'm just generally out on the street. And really, one of the big lessons here is remember this moral conduct. Remember your spirituality. Remember your beliefs. Remember the plumb in those times of difficulty. There's someone who cuts you off in traffic. As much as you want to flip them off or yell at them, but we don't do that in the Midwest, so basically you kind of wave at them and give them that passive-aggressive smile that says, yeah, I know you messed up. But we shouldn't be doing that because that goes against the lessons that we've been taught. That is allowing our plumb to waver from vertical. It's very much, to me, the symbolism is one of those sound gauges on an old stereo where you would see it vibrating back and forth, popping back and forth as the volume changes. And that's what you're seeing. It becomes this guide. We want it to be as vertical as possible, as often as possible. The plumb, and its Masonic symbolism, is a powerful reminder of the high moral standards that Freemasons must strive to embody in their daily lives. By understanding and internalizing the symbol's meaning, any member of the fraternity is better equipped to navigate the complexities of life with steadfastness, resilience, and unwavering moral conviction. In doing so, they will not only improve themselves, but also create a stronger, more harmonious society. Because imagine if everyone had the same consistency. If you could know what someone is going to do in reaction and that what they're going to do is really the right thing. You don't have to worry about someone completely going off for more or less no reason. How beautiful would society be? That is universal Masonry. That is one of those universal virtues that we teach through the working tools, but every other society has taught at some level. So that being said, thank you for joining me, Brother Chris Litke, and the entire Further Light team on your quest to find more light through Masonry.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.